Welcome to From Hollywood to the Heartland. From Hollywood to the Heartland. From Tinseltown to Middle America. Stories and insights about showbiz, along with lots of laughter. It's all right. Here's your host, veteran podcaster, Beau Tiffany.
Absolutely, man. I'm glad to join you. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Been looking forward to this for a few days now, and your story is amazing. You're also an author. You've shared a lot of what you've been through. One thing I like to do is just dig into the roots a little bit. If you don't mind, let me ask you a few questions. Where are you from originally? What state?
Originally Arizona. I was born and raised here in Phoenix.
Okay. Big family, small family?
Pretty big. Yeah, considering when I look at other family. I guess I never really think about how big the family was, because we used to have family reunions when I was a kid, and man, there'd be 7,500 people. They'd come from all over, Oklahoma, Texas, California, and they'd all gather here. So mainly on my mom's side. My dad, I didn't really know him. He and my mom got divorced when I was probably must have been about 4, going on 5. And so my father figures were all on my mom's side. My mom's side was the big family, big hillbilly family.
Did you have any siblings, or were you an only child?
No, I was an only child. I have a stepbrother. As my mom remarried later on, I gained a stepbrother out of the deal, but he lived in a different town with his mom, so I would just see him. So I was it was me and my cousins were my hangout partners, other than the guys I grew up with in the neighborhood.
Sure. Well, being from that area, Spanish is a pretty common second language. Did you start speaking that early?
I did not. I started understanding Spanish more than I spoke it. That's still true today. So the neighborhood I grew up in was primarily Hispanic. And I think I first started learning basic Spanish with my best friend growing up was a guy named Jose, and his mom called him Pepe. And I would learn Spanish going over there. One of the first things was a greeting at the door, when she would basically call out his name, and Pepe, el güero está aquí. And so she was telling him, like, hey, the white boy's here.
So you got enough picked up to get by. The reason I ask is your career in law enforcement really took on an immersive life within the Hispanic culture to give you an eye-opening understanding and look at it. And so I was wondering how that developed for you. I don't want to skip over too much. I should ask you before we get to that point. Did you go to college straight out of high school? What got you interested in law enforcement as a field?
I'll tackle the law enforcement piece first, and then I'll go back and I'll hit the Spanish and immersion into the Mexican culture stuff. I did a little bit of community college right out of high school. I figured out very quickly that I was super bored with school and I needed to move on and just get to work. And so at the age of 19 is when I started applying for different law enforcement agencies. And I was always drawn to some type of service. My grandparents were World War II veterans. And I think that had a lot to do with being drawn to service, just watching them, watching my grandpa. My grandpa was really my father figure, and watching him and his buddies who were in the war with him, how they interacted, how they hung out together, just all that stuff, the camaraderie, the brotherhood. I was always, like most kids my age, I'm a Gen Xer, so I was a latchkey kid. I came home by myself. I spent a lot of time, again, with my grandfather. And so I would play Army, I would play cops and robbers, and that was the stuff growing up. And so it was just a natural thing for me. And then I grew up in a rough area, so I had a lot of exposure to law enforcement. The other side, right? I saw them come into our neighborhood to deal with criminals and crime. So I had interactions with them. And I think watching them and how they interacted with our neighborhood, that I grew an affinity towards them through that. And
can I ask real quick, how were they in your neighborhood? Were they good law enforcement officers that really set that example for you?
Yeah, they were. There was a distinct feeling of us against them growing up. Mm-hmm. And so the neighborhood I grew up in, I wouldn't say that people particularly cared for the cops, because it was us against them. And even though, I wasn't really involved in crime, it was still us against them, because they would take away family members, whatever. Given that, especially gang cops had a pretty heavy presence in our neighborhood, and they were some of the coolest cops I ever dealt with. They were down to business, down to earth, and treated us harshly, but with respect, if that makes sense. So they would not play games with us, but they would also give us respect and not treat us like dirt. And watching that kind of was my formative years of watching law enforcement and seeing how they interact with people.
I find every neighborhood's different, but the approach that the officers come with has a lot to do with the respect that they earn within the neighborhood. And I think what you're talking about is really in line with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the gang cops are different. I think they have a really tough job, and I've worked gangs and I've worked my whole career. You're dealing with some of the worst, and so you have to filter through good people, some not so good people, and some straight evil people. So they do a good job of navigating all that. And in our neighborhood, you'd have a family where one guy was a straight up criminal, and the rest of his family, they were upstanding people. And so you had to know how to navigate that as well. Yeah, that was it. So I was 19. I started applying, 20 years old. I got hired. And at that same time, my now wife, then girlfriend, became pregnant. And so at 20 years old, I was faced with starting a family. And we got married. And I actually started the job first, and then we got married shortly thereafter. And 30 years later, we're still married, luckily, and 30 years of a career too. So she's been on the whole ride with me.
That's amazing.
It's tough to do in this career. It's tough to do. She's been an angel.
It's amazing to me because such big responsibilities at such a young age, and most people aren't prepped for that by that age. So your home life must have been really exceptional.
Yeah,
just props to the family.
I had I had one of the most unique upbringings I think I could have had, because on one side I had a single mom who was trying to make it on her own. We were in Section 8 housing, which is government subsidized housing. We were in a neighborhood that was rough, but I had my grandparents close by, and my grandfather, grandmother were super good role models, super good people. My grandfather was a small business owner, so I watched him do business with people, and I learned from that. And then my extended family, my aunts and uncles, were all good and all there. So on one side of the spectrum, I had a good system of support. And on the other side of the spectrum, I was exposed to the criminals, the gangs, the broken homes, all that stuff. And so I was in and out of both worlds, which I think ultimately helped me when I became undercover, because you're floating in and out of those same worlds.
Yeah, no, exactly. How did your mom keep you on track, especially mingling with that other life, if you will?
With extreme threats of violence.
Love it.
No, I don't know that she always kept me on track. I got off track a little bit, but she saw when I was about 13, 14, probably 14, 15, or like it. Some of my buddies were getting in trouble. A couple of them had been shot already. And so she started to see the writing on the wall and knew that we had to get out of that area. And so she had already been making preparations to move out of the inner city. And she made that move the end of my freshman year, which was probably the thing that saved me from falling into that life or getting caught up in it, moving us out to a rural area, which still had a heavy Hispanic population and influence, but rural farming area, so completely different from the inner city, and quite a culture shock for me the first year or so.
Yeah, I'm sure. You and I have a lot in common. So I had a single mom, didn't know my dad hardly at all, didn't know my family much, but I turned out to be this driven individual. My grandparents were blessings to me because they were excellent role models. And for me, I also dabbled in the gray side a little bit, trying to figure out who I was. And those experiences not only shaped me, but also helped me to understand. And you alluded a little bit before how you were able to jump in and out of this other lifestyle, if you will. I like to think of it as being a chameleon. I can relate to people of so many different backgrounds and experiences because of how I was raised and that exposure that I had. I feel comfortable where a lot of people maybe wouldn't. And that sounds like that's one of the gifts that you came away with too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a lot of what's missing, right, in today's world, and why people just can't get along. It's really not, when you talk about all the isms and ists that they throw on to the end of words, it's really not that. It really comes down to we're human beings, and we're uncomfortable with stuff we don't understand. When you talk about other cultures and you don't understand the culture, it makes it uncomfortable for you. And so you drop a white boy into an all Mexican neighborhood or an all black neighborhood, he's not going to know how to navigate that because it's different culturally, and vice
Yeah.
versa. If you took a Mexican guy and dropped him into an all white neighborhood, he's not going to know how to navigate that. And so it was a very good upbringing because I was around so many cultures. I was high Hispanic culture in my neighborhood, but I also had a lot of Black friends, and you would learn to navigate that. One of my best friends growing up next door was a Black guy that father was a Black pastor. I would go to their all Black church and hang out with him. And so you're just exposed to these cultures where you become comfortable because you understand they're different, but it's all good.
Yep, absolutely. And I found that I like new things, being tossed into new environments that I haven't been in before. So traveling for me, especially internationally, became a big thing. How did the exposure and that lifestyle growing up affect you?
I think it just made me more well-rounded and gave me a better ability, especially doing this job, being a cop, because you're exposed to everything, right? You're going to everybody's house and it's the worst time. And typically speaking, you have to, when you get there, you have to figure it all out. And so it really helps you navigate all of that because I think being exposed to a bunch of different cultures, a bunch of different things, that you have a better sense of danger when you see it. You have a better sense of what's right, what's wrong, what's missing, when something's a little funky. I think you just pick up on things quicker and better than people who are not exposed to that. So I think all around it just made me a better cop. And in the sense that I could deal with people, because that's the core function of this job. You're just dealing with people and you have to figure out how to deal with them. And contrary to popular belief, like I don't like fighting all the time. And unfortunately, we have to get into violent situations sometimes as a cop. But I would much rather talk my way through something than fight my way out of it. And I learned a lot of that growing up as well, because being one white guy in a Mexican neighborhood, you learn how to talk your way out of some stuff.
What I'm hearing is you were a seasoned officer when you first started. Things that officers typically probably would pick up over the years, you came straight out of the academy with, which I think is something that really helps. So let's turn the page a little bit. How did you get into the segment of law enforcement that you decided to go? Because you were dealing with gangs and cartels, and in the academy was Arizona's closer to the border. I'm sure the law enforcement down there is a lot different than Wisconsin, where I live. Was this something that was offered in the academy, or were you groomed for it?
No, I think I had been groomed for the type of work I got into. As you stated, growing up, that's what I was exposed to. That's what I was comfortable with. Again, growing up young around gangs, I had been shot at before I became a cop. I was exposed to violence. I had been jumped before on my way to school or on my way from school. I had seen other friends that have been shot. So the violent stuff, the gang stuff, and then drugs is always hand in hand with all that. So you're around and you see all that stuff going. My elementary school, I think I was in seventh, maybe eighth grade. And the ice cream guy that would sell ice cream on the corner after school, he got taken down in front of us by Phoenix PD because he was actually selling dope and ice cream. Being exposed to that kind of stuff as you grow up, you learn the game. And I think that some of the best cops out there are the ones that come from those environments and then decide to go into a career to do good rather than bad.
That leads me to a great question. I'm not sure if you were ever initiated into a gang. I guess that would be my first one. If not, would it be difficult for an officer with that previous allegiance to get into that line of work, or is it easier? I guess it depends on the reasons that you're getting into it.
It would. So, first question, no, I wasn't. Essentially, I wasn't jumped in. And for the gangs in my neighborhood growing up, you would have had to have been officially jumped into the gang, been recognized as a member, and I wasn't. I think as law enforcement defines it, I would have been an affiliate because a couple of my buddies were gangsters and got into that life and were documented, jumped in, all that stuff. It just never was my thing. The weird thing was we all grew up playing soccer together, basketball together, baseball together. So we were all just kids growing up playing sports together and stuff. And a few of them ended up falling into that gang life, getting officially jumped in, but they would still do those things. We'd still play ball together and stuff. But because you hang out with them, you are now affiliated, whether you like it or not. And you had to know your boundaries because If I went past certain streets in my neighborhood, I was out of bounds. And that's when you get jumped. That's when you get shot at. And it has nothing to do with me being in the gang. It's because I'm affiliated, just because my friends are in that gang. So it's a very weird upbringing in that sense. And you learn all these imaginary lines, imaginary boundaries, and anybody that's grown up in a gangster neighborhood, they know what I'm talking about. You could go one street over and you are now out of the area where you're safe and you're in an area where you're not so safe because you're in enemy territory. And you never define the boundaries. They're always defined for you, and you have to watch the graffiti and be able to read it and know where you're at and whose territory you're in. And I even had girlfriends as I got into high school, and I would have to sneak in to see them because they were in neighborhoods that I really couldn't be in because of my friends. So it was definitely different.
Yeah, I can only imagine. In Wisconsin, I guess Milwaukee and whatnot starting to change because we've got a lot of the Chicago overflow that's come up over the years. But when I was in school, and I'm 49 now, so it's been a few years. But when I was in school, it was a lot of pretenders, a lot of people that would act a certain way or say they're in a gang and flash the signs. But I noticed, especially traveling and getting older, and the exposure that I got, is that places like Madison, where I grew up, they're so different from places like Chicago, where gang lifestyles are a method of survival. You talked about that brotherhood early on with military and such, and I feel like the gangs create a brotherhood, and it's almost like urban civil war. And it's the older I get, the more I understand it. I also understand the reasons sometimes behind it and some of the politics. Let me ask you about that. What are your takeaways? What are you seeing that's feeding the urban inner city issues that we have? Is there any huge triggers that you could put your finger on, or is it a culmination of small things that add up to be what it is?
Man, if I had the magic answer to that, I'd be a millionaire, bro. It's a bunch of different things, but to walk through it to some of your points and questions, yeah, you grow up in an environment where it is very easy to get sucked into it, and even if you don't want to, right? You're at a spot and something kicks off and you try to help one of your friends, and all of a sudden everything goes sideways, and you could find yourself, and I've had friends in this situation where they're just trying to help a friend, and all of a sudden they're getting arrested for an assault or an ag assault or something like that. So it's very easy to get caught up. You get caught out of bounds, and somebody goes to jump you, fight you, whatever, and you try and fight your way out of that, and you end up hurting somebody that you didn't even know. You could end up getting in a fight with people you didn't even know. They were just helping whoever was coming after you. And now you have new enemies that you didn't count on, and it just compounds and compounds. And it's a turf war all the time. There's constantly pushes back and forth they're trying to push their territory, and people are trying to hold on to their territory. So it's constant pushes back and forth. And then, of course, the prisons these days control a lot of that stuff. So the prisons are the shot callers, and they'll determine who's going to fight who, or who needs to go after who, or a lot of that stuff.
And that's because the leaders are in prison, but still calling the shots.
Gotcha. And they graduate up. So they move from street gangs into the Mexican mafia or some of the black prison gangs or white prison gangs. And then they become bosses in prison, and they start calling shots and telling the streets how things are going to go. And that's another way you get caught up, right? You get ordered to go do something, and if you don't do it, then you're going to pay the price on the other end. It's very easy to get caught up and very easy to get manipulated into that system. And then it's hard to get out, right? You just get into almost a spiral once you get caught up in that mess, and getting out can be difficult. And it's generational. In the neighborhood I grew up in, there was probably 3 generations of gangsters in that neighborhood. So their grandpa was a gangster, their dad was a gangster, and now they're a gangster. It's just,
I feel like it started out of the 20s and 30s with Al Capone and the bootlegging, and we had gangs throughout history, especially early on in American history, but they weren't as organized, in my opinion, as I think there was some things that the mafia lent to gang culture. And so you have these turf wars, and they homogenize, if you will, so the stronger one wins out. And it's my understanding that in a fundamental small piece of the way, that's how your cartels start, right?
Yeah. a lot of it, if we look at the Mexican cartels specifically, they started as kind of one cartel, the Guadalajara cartel, and that cartel controlled everything. And at that point in the game, the Mexicans were just transporters for the Colombians, right? The Colombians really controlled it, and the Mexicans were just getting the Colombian product through. And then the Mexicans kind of started taking over power when all the stuff with Pablo Escobar went down. He got killed. There were these power vacuums. The Mexicans were able to seize that power and started to take more and more control. And then as they did that, they started to become the target of the US government because they were getting bigger and badder. And so in an effort to insulate themselves further, they divided up territories, and that became what is cartels today. So those territories went on to be specific cartels, and then bosses of those territories didn't agree with each other. So you may have the Sinaloa Plaza didn't agree with the Tamaulipas Plaza, and so all of a sudden you have a war, and they were actually allies at one point. Now they're warring. And so you have two cartels fighting, and it has just compounded over the years. And they'll split, they'll fraction off, they'll fight each other. Sometimes they'll realign because they have a common enemy. And it's just a constant flowing thing.
And I'd like to ask a few questions regarding cartel aspects. We always hear about Mexican cartels or Colombian cartels, but I've had some firsthand experience with some issues in the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Epstein set up shop. And there is court cases, criminal cases are taking an average of 12 years to get through. Civil cases are suspended in limbo, going up to 2000, I believe. And the ODC, or the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, they only have a part-time person to investigate, and their complaints are stretching back to 1996. With over 200 in backlog. I unfortunately got stuck in this because I had a horrible accident in the Virgin Islands, and then was misrepresented, and trying to find justice for that became something even bigger that I didn't understand at first until I started to meet the right people and get the right information. And I'm curious because one of the things that I found is that, especially for Colombia, it's a main stopping point for trafficking. That small little territory has a lot of news coverage for being corrupt. Have you ever dealt with anything that passed through that region that's cartel related? Do you have any knowledge?
The majority of what we deal with here in Arizona has been the Sinaloa cartel. So anything you get that's coming through is typically controlled by them and coordinated by them. That has changed a little bit because there's been a split, and you have the CJNG, which is the Cartel Jalisco Nuevo Generacion. They're coming to power. They're fighting the Sinaloans, Chapo's people. They're fighting for power, but they've always controlled our state. And so anything we see is typically directly from them. So if there's stuff coming from the Virgin Islands, Colombia directly, it's already been filtered through the Mexican contacts, and that's who we deal with.
Gotcha. When one thing as Americans, especially in the North, that we don't really understand as much, we hear a lot about the cartels and the government of Mexico, and we have this opinion of, or at least a lot of the people I know think it's, that Mexico is a corrupt place and the government's corrupt. Is that the case, or is that misconception? And how are relationships being fostered now that might improve the situation that you're currently dealing with?
So I would say, I wouldn't say Mexico's a corrupt state, but I think they are corrupted, right? Meaning that there is corruption in the Mexican government, and the cartels have a stranglehold on portions of the government because they have absolutely infiltrated everything down there. They're involved in everything. And if people aren't familiar with their mantra, it's plata or plomo. So they're going to get you with silver, or they're going to get you with lead, meaning that you may make money working for them, or you may die if you don't work for them. And so that's their mantra. And it's very effective down there because they hold a level of control on certain portions of the government, local, state, federal, where they can affect their power. They can take out hits on people and complete them however they want to. And I'll give you an example. We talked to a former local cop in Mexico that had become a bad guy. And we asked him how it happened. And it was exactly that. He basically told us a story of how they provided him with pictures of his family on the side of the road. They trapped him in, provided him pictures of his family, and said, here's the current addresses that they are all at, your children and your wife. And you have basically a couple minutes to make a decision. Are you with us or are you not? If you're not, we're going to execute them all. And if you're with us, then you'll be fine. And this is what you have to do. And so he had to make a choice. Do I say yes and become corrupt and save my family? Or do I stand my ground and say no and hope that they're bluffing and will not kill my family? And generally speaking, the cartels don't bluff.
Yeah, it's such a paradigm shift from America. Although I feel like a lot of this is starting to infiltrate our borders and has for quite a while now. MS-13, if I'm getting the name correct, a lot in the news. Obviously, that's, I believe, originates from Mexico. Is that true, or is that a different country?
No, it's an El Salvador gang.
Okay. So the things that we're dealing with here in the States are oftentimes, especially Arizona, bleed off from being directly in contact with the border.
Right.
Trump tried to put up a border wall. What are your thoughts and opinions on that?
So part of the wall was actually already up. They had started the wall years earlier. Trump was trying to complete it, and they started to complete it. And so for people who don't understand the wall here in like California, Arizona, into Texas, if you go to, let's just take Arizona. If you go to Arizona and go to our southern border, there are areas of the border that are terrain prohibitive to put up a wall. There's just sheer cliffs, and nobody's really getting through there anyways. Those are areas typically that they stay away from because they're so treacherous. Then there are other areas that are flat land with 3 strands of barbed wire, so you can cut the barbed wire and walk across or drive across or whatever. And those are the areas typically that they're trying to put up the wall. And what the wall would do for us in law enforcement in Arizona is it would funnel the traffic. It's not going to stop. It's going to deter it. And it allows us an opportunity at that border to put up technology. So they would have sensors, cameras, drones. And so it slows them down from coming across, slows them down enough that technology can pick up on them and let Border Patrol know, hey, at this exact location, you have an intrusion. And then they can deploy assets to that one spot, deal with it, hopefully capture them, and we're good to go. As it sits right now, it's fairly wide open in Arizona. So they didn't complete the wall. So there's these just open desert areas where you can drive across or walk across. And even with technology, it's hard to narrow down those areas and have Border Patrol respond effectively. So
is the wall an effective countermeasure? We see the tunneling and such that they do quite often, which is so sophisticated. Railroad systems underground to transport. It just one of the things that us Northerns don't know about much, and so it's hard for us to know how to support it. Is the wall effective? These sensors that you have, are they able now finally to detect the tunneling so we can have a wall and then also be able to ensure that below ground we're still safe as well?
Yeah, the walls are absolutely effective. Are they fail-proof? Absolutely not. If you build a 22-foot wall, they're going to build a 23-foot ladder, right? They're going to figure a way around it. They're not constrained by government procurement or anything like that. They have an endless supply of money. They're violent. They don't follow the rules. And so they will always figure a way out. But does the wall help? Absolutely. It absolutely helps law enforcement. It helps deter them. It helps slow them down. And I think about it as your yard, right? Your backyard. If you have a fence around your backyard because you have dogs, does that help keep your dogs in the yard, or does it allow them to just run all over the place? And if you don't have a fence, your dogs or your animals are able to run all over the place. Same concept, right? We're just trying to slow them down. We're trying to deter them, trying to keep it contained as much as possible in specific areas.
Closing this chapter, thoughts on the future of the battles with the cartels? What needs to happen to make a difference right now that hasn't yet?
One of the biggest things we've been pushing for that would make an absolute night and day difference is the U.S. government designating the cartels in Mexico as narco-terrorists, which is what they are. If they would give that designation, it would open up different types of prosecution. It would open up the ability to lock down money associated with them. So what people don't understand is if you're designated as a terrorist group, narco-terrorist group, what happens is any legitimate business that does business with them and is on the peripheral, banks that hold their money, businesses that may launder their money or pass money through, all that type of stuff, you can start locking those places up too. So you start taking their money, freezing their accounts, prosecuting them. And then what happens is it starts to cut off all of their resources. And so it starts to isolate them and it makes it very hard for them to do business. And then the other piece that it opens up is the use of our U.S. military to go in and deal with some of those heads, just like you would a terrorist organization overseas. You would designate your top targets, and our special dudes that go out there and do that special stuff at night would go and take out those high value targets or take in those high value targets, either way, and start cutting off the head of the snake. And all those things would help immediately.
Good to know. I hope there's the right people listening to
I hope so too.
So all of these experiences culminated to you writing a book called Interceptors that provides an intense and unique perspective on the realities of combating the drug cartels on America's southern border. What prompted you to write the book and document these experiences in the form of a book?
I think one of the main driving factors for me was the fact that I knew we were doing work that less than 1% of the U.S. law enforcement was doing. We were doing some really unique stuff and fighting them in a very unique way. And so I wanted to just document that. And because I worked with so many great people, and the normal public had no idea that this was even going on. And they still don't a lot of times have any idea that this type of stuff is going on. So I wanted to get that out there. I wanted to document it for all the heroes that have worked that work and fought that battle. And then I just wanted to give a no BS view of what we actually deal with. There's no political agenda behind it. I'm just telling you, here's what happened. Here's how we did things. Here's how we fought them. Here's how they act, so that people have a good understanding, because everything is so skewed these days, right? If you open up your social media, it's feeding you what you like. So you can't even get unbiased opinions. And I just wanted to put something out there that was not political, not biased, just here's what it is, man. Here's what we did, here's how we did it, and here's how they did things. And then in the beginning of the book, I give a little bit of my history and background, because I felt people are going to pick this up and be like, why is this white guy talking about Mexican cartels and Mexican heritage? And so I wanted to establish where I gained my expertise on that. Then I go into the cartel structure, some of their beliefs, because they have specific religious beliefs that are in line with Catholicism and not, because it's its own thing and it's very dark magic kind of stuff.
How did that evolve?
Say again, I'm sorry.
So how did that evolve?
That's a hard question, because I know just from growing up and again, being married, my wife is Mexican and her family was from the Chihuahua area. And in Chihuahua, they have what essentially translates to healers. And in that culture, there's white magic, black magic is the only way I can really break it down for people to understand. So Sure. There are healers who are in it for good, and there are those that are in it for bad. And it's the dark forces, and it's almost voodoo-ish when you look at it. So the dark stuff is where the cartels gravitate towards. And that's Santa Muerte is one of the big dark magic kind of figures that they pray to. And they pray for stuff like, kill my enemies, let me get drugs through to the US. So they're praying for being able to commit crimes and heinous stuff. And then what they did is they mixed it in. They'll call them saints, and they're actually referred to as narco saints. But if you go to the Catholic Church, like Santa Muerte looks a lot like Holy Death from the Catholic religion. But if you go to the Catholic Church and talk to them, they're like, no, wait, we don't condone that. That is not our thing. And it is not a legitimate recognized religion. However, they practice it very heavily, and It has a cult following, and yeah, so it's very strong in that region.
The first thing to understanding people is understanding their culture and their history.
Yeah, and that's it. If you understand the culture and the dark magic stuff, it's always been there, but it has never been like this, right? There's always been these things that go on, but there's never been the cult-like following of dark magic in Mexico specifically. Because if you think about it, Mexico it's a heavy Catholic region. And growing up, I grew up, almost all of my friends were Catholic, and I grew up Catholic. And so that's a very just prevalent religion in Mexico. And then they have split off and created this dark magic. And how it's being followed by the younger generations reminds me a lot of the gangster rap push back in the 80s. So when gangster rap came around, and then all of a sudden you had kids all over the country, the police and all that stuff. Sorry, I don't know if I'm cussing.
We're a podcast, you're okay.
All right, cool. But it reminds me of that, because now you have this cult-like following. So these youngsters are watching this and they're like, oh, I want to be a narco and I want to follow that dark magic. But it gets practiced more and more.
Yeah, it's funny how they look up to the weirdest stuff sometimes. It depends on what culture puts forth as being cool. And every generation is different, but typically kids always look up to the adults. With that said,
I think historically you can say that these young kids, especially when you're talking about impoverished areas, man, that guy has beautiful women, he has beautiful cars, he has a big house, lots of cash. That's what I want to be, right? I don't want to be poor.
Right.
I want to be that guy. And so they think that they can get into that life and get that lifestyle.
Interesting. Your experience provides a firsthand perspective that often isn't found in media or political discourse, as you mentioned. Can you delve a little bit more into the common misconceptions or the misunderstandings about cartel activities and law enforcement's efforts to combat them?
Yeah, I think some of the misconceptions is that the cartels are very organized, but very disorganized at the same time. They have some very rudimentary structures, and they have some very paramilitary structures, and it's an organic thing. And when you talk about a cartel, like a Mexican cartel, let's take the Sinaloa cartel. When you talk about the Sinaloa cartel, there are those bosses at the top, and it has a very paramilitary structure. But then as it flows down, it just flows into this thing where it's just people who are doing things to try and make their way, and they happen to be doing it for this organization. It's like in our area, you'll have a guy that is working on a farm and he's doing irrigation, but at the same time, he carries a phone or a radio and reports law enforcement locations, and he makes some money off that on the side. And so by proxy, he is a cartel member because he's working for the Sinaloa cartel to further their operation. But he is really just an irrigator who's trying to make some extra money. And so you have all these layers and levels to this thing, and it's like a huge onion, and you just keep peeling it back, and there's all these levels and layers. And then the other thing that people need to understand is the familial bonds, right? So the part of Arizona, I'm in Pinal County, which is right in between Phoenix and Tucson, and the southern part of our county was Mexico before we bought it, right? And so there's familial bonds because the U.S. buys some territory, and all of a sudden they move the line further south. And families that were south of that line stayed in Mexico. Families that were north of that line, they were now U.S. citizens, but they still had family ties across that border, because you may have Theo or a Thea, an uncle that lives up here and is now a U.S. citizen, but his brother lives in a different town in Mexico. And so they still obviously are family, going to visit each other, all of the stuff that goes along with the family. And a lot of the business is done based on those familial ties. So when you look at the cartels, a lot of how they separated, where they're at, the territories they cover is all based on family stuff as well. So it's a lot like the Italian mob in that sense, right? That it's all family driven and oriented. And then you get down to these lower street levels. And then as it relates to street gangs, I think people have a misconception that the cartels and the gangs are very tight. And that's not necessarily the case all the time. The street gangs are a thing of their own in the U.S. And while they have to do business with the cartels, and some of them do report to the cartels specifically for distribution and stuff, those are loose ties. They're not real strong ties. And even if it's a Mexican gang working with a Mexican cartel, because another misconception is that a Mexican American is well accepted by a Mexican national. And that's not true. The Mexican nationals look down on, they would call a Mexican American. So, like, my wife would be called a gringa, which is a derogatory term, meaning she's from the US. She's a white girl, essentially. And the Mexican nationals view the Mexican Americans as spoiled brats, right? And so there's that cultural thing that goes on as well within the cartels.
That's so interesting, especially considering we have so many people trying to cross the border to become part of America. But if they look at us as being spoiled, then I can understand that appeal. Being on this side of the fence for any people from Mexico,
they want to be spoiled too.
Yeah, I feel like the grass always looks greener on the other side.
I think it is in this case, though, because I can tell you with my wife's family, her family in Chihuahua, they were in some smaller areas of Chihuahua, smaller towns. And I remember when we were first getting together, she was like, yeah, they still don't have running water. And I'm like, wow, you can't fathom that when you're from a first world country.
Yeah. I found it interesting. Like, I've been 12, 13 countries, but I went to Jamaica and I stayed with a friend that graduated UW-Madison, but his home was right next to, it was in a community where you had houses with tin roofs and tin siding and a dirt floor right next to a home that in the US might cost 200,000 or more. I was very surprised because here we have more of a class separation than some other places that I visited. Looking at Mexico and such, how I feel like the country is made up of ethnic villages and cultures within that pocket, if you will. Am I right on or fairly accurate when it comes to that?
You're absolutely. And the easiest way to liken it for Americans is like me. I'm in the Southwest and I have a daughter that lives in the South. And there is a distinct difference. If I go to the South, they can tell I'm not from there. And if a Southerner comes to Arizona, just by their draw alone, I can tell they're not from here. So you get the same kind of nuances down in Mexico where, so for instance, people from Mexico City, my wife's family would refer to them as chilangos. And it means like they talk differently. They think they're more special because they're from Mexico City, things like that. So there are cultural nuances that make the regions or the zones different. And even the Spanish, there's things, Spanish slang that if it's said in one region means one thing and in another region it means something completely different. It could be a greeting in one area and it can be an insult in another area.
Yeah. Interesting how that works.
Mm-hmm. That's crazy.
We're getting close to our end. I want to talk about the emotional and psychological tolls that a career in law enforcement, especially one like yours, can have on both you and family. I think that the stress of coping with the inherent traumas and stress that you're living in and dealing with on a regular basis has to be something that, as much as you don't want to, still comes home with you sometimes, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I don't know the exact statistic. I should, but I try to not pay attention to that particular statistic. But I think most normal people are exposed to a handful of traumas on a really bad day. Most people living their life have been exposed to 2-3 significant traumas. Law enforcement officers, they say throughout our career, like a 30-year career, I've probably had 1,000 or more exposures. And it does wear on you and it starts to manifest itself into physiological problems. So what you start noticing at the end of your career is things that happen that are out of your control. Your blood pressure starts going up and you have no control on why it's doing that. A lot of us are pre-diabetic or diabetic because it wears on your body. Typically speaking, the stats still say that we will die within 5 years of retirement from some type of cardiac event because our heart has been through so much, the cortisol dumps, the adrenaline dumps, the ups, the downs, and the hypervigilance, compassion fatigue. It all just wears on you, right? And you don't even know it at the time. And that's why a lot of us end up divorced, in bad relationships, alcoholics, all that stuff, is because the psychological effects of the job wear you down so much. But it's weird because it becomes your norm. So you don't even know that it's abnormal. So in
Mhm.
my world, like everything seems normal. And for me, my marriage has not always been great. After 30 years, we've had our ups and downs. And we were at one point, we were separated on the verge of divorce. And when you go through something like that, if you have true introspect, and I had to at this point because I didn't want to lose my family. So you start looking at yourself and you realize that because you get to a place where you think everybody in the world is an asshole, but you figure out that you're the asshole. And it's because of all that stuff you deal with all the time. And so you have to be cognizant of that, and you have to have countermeasures, right? You have to have work-life balance. You're not going to stop the bad things from happening because that's the job we have to deal with, but you have to create and maintain a lifestyle that counters that. You have to exercise. You have to have good eating habits. You have to break out of having law enforcement friends and expose yourself to people outside of law enforcement, a circle of people that influence your life positively, because law enforcement is very negative. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on in this career and a lot of stuff that you have to counter. And I think our career is doing better than it's ever done at that. Because when I was first coming up, it was suck it up, buttercup, just shut up, do your job.
Right.
Don't ask
Yeah.
questions. If you have to cry, you go cry by yourself and don't tell anybody you did it. If you break down because you saw something horrible, you try and stop that and tuck it away in a closet somewhere. But what I have found, and I know specifically, I can talk about me, that closet eventually fills up and the door comes busting open at the most inopportune time. And
Right.
so you have to deal with these things. And I never thought in my entire adult life that I would have a psych that I normally see. But the minute that I started that, I started noticing relief from some of the stuff I was telling you about, the high blood pressure, the anxiety, everything that goes along with the pressures of the job.
Yeah,
And so,
the physical manifestations of all that stress.
absolutely.
One of the things that I deal with a lot on my podcast is mental health. So that's why I wanted to get closer to end with that question.
Yeah.
You said that it's changed a lot, and you explained some of the downfalls when you first started your career. What kind of support is there now that it's in place that makes it such a night and day difference for you?
So I can tell you in my position, I'm in a leadership role at my agency, and I have the ability to affect a lot of change there. And so one of the things we have changed specifically is when we have traumatic events take place, it triggers a system. And essentially, when you have certain things happen, that triggers a reaction by the agency for the employee. And we immediately get them connected we have a psych doctor that is specific for law enforcement, because you can't have just normal psychs deal with us because we're different, much like the military. And so we have that on contract, on staff. And when a significant event, and even if they don't take them up on it, they don't want to talk to the psych, we still offer it. We have them respond. We have them connect with the employee. We try and get those employees diffused and debriefed right away by the psych so that they can talk some of that stuff out. Because what people don't realize or give credit for a lot of times, because they just don't know the job or they don't care to know, I could respond to a call where I had to do CPR on a baby that died. And then 5 minutes later, I'm responding to a domestic violence where you and your wife are fighting. And I am still trying to process that I just was not able to save a baby, and I'm having to deal with your bullshit at your house where you can't get along for 5 minutes. And people fail to recognize that a lot of times is that we deal with mentally quite a bit of stuff, and we have to process it and try and do our job. And so there's days where I've had guys that have snapped on somebody because they were just pegged out, and people will say, "Oh my God, he should lose his job because he cussed at me." And you really have no clue of what's really going on. Yeah, he lost it. He should have remained professional. People are people. And so that's another thing that has changed, at least for us in our agency, is when we have guys and gals that get in trouble, instead of saying, how could they do this, and persecuting them right off the bat, we try to ask what's going on with them, right? Because most of that is not normal behavior when they get in trouble. And so that's another avenue of approach that we've taken that I think works out better is, okay, this person messed up. What's going on in their life that they made this mistake and approach it from that angle. Because if we can identify something, then we can work on that piece and just deal with the behavior stuff on another side.
Yeah. You nailed it. People are people. It doesn't matter if you're in a gang, a cartel, police officer, president. We all have basic desires, certain things, chemistry wise. Dopamine is a big driving force, obviously, behind a lot of things. I think a lot of our intelligence gives us the ability to develop control over our bio impulses. The first thing is the awareness. The second thing is learning the skills to not give in to some of the habits as humans that we possess inherently, or at least things that turn detrimental. You see it all over history. I find it a privilege to have someone like you on to hear really an uncensored, raw truth about things.
But
I was
at this point in my life, that's the only way to be, man.
Yeah. When I was going to have you on, I was going to ask you about all these stories. I wanted to hear the meat and the juice and all that. And that's, for me, I think that's just selfish. I think there's so much more to it. And obviously it's glamorous lifestyle. What we see in TV and in the movies is barely a fraction of the reality. And so Hollywood has glamorized some of these things and made it appealing and just normal culture, if you will. Like you said, if you live in an impoverished community, but your next door neighbor is driving a Lamborghini and has a huge swimming pool and house, that looks attractive.
And I think just a quick point for your listeners as well is people often ask, how can we get back to a good place between law enforcement and our communities? And that's it right there, is connecting with them, not categorizing all of us by one of our mistakes. And that happens all the time. And it happens on both sides. Law enforcement does the same thing to people, right? But not categorizing us all by one of our mistakes, viewing us as normal people. And then one of the bigger things is getting our youth engaged with our law enforcement, because when they started taking cops out of schools and started limiting that exposure, that is where we started to see the divide come. And so if you think back to a decade or so ago, when they did away with DARE program, they started taking cops out of schools, all that stuff, that those people are the adults now that are the ones that are very divisive and the ones that are out there, fuck the pigs, fuck the police, all that stuff. And it's because we didn't develop a human relationship between one another as just two human beings. And that's what we need to get back to. And we're starting to see the pendulum swing back. We're getting more cops in schools because you develop those relationships with even those troubled kids. And there's been plenty of troubled kids that have been sent in a different direction because they had those interactions.
Most of those troubled kids just need someone to listen to them and then point them in the right direction. I don't see anyone, don't get me wrong, there's always those small percents, but I don't think anyone's born inherently evil or bad. We all try to do the best we can with what we're given. And all of us come from a different situation, having a little bit of patience and an open mind to understand that we don't know where each other are coming from and giving each other the space to just be us without judgment.
That's the biggest thing is just, again, be good human, just have some grace and give some grace.
Absolutely. Last question and I'll let you go. Exit strategy from a career like yours.
Man, that's a tough one. I wish I knew the answer to that one too. For me, the book has been a little bit of a boost, right, in that area. I never wrote the book thinking it was going to be a New York Times bestseller. I had no illusions of that because I self-published. But the book itself has opened some doors for me. I love teaching. I love speaking. So those are two things that I'm really passionate about. And I do a lot of teaching as it relates to undercover work, operational planning, SWAT stuff, because I was a SWAT guy for a number of years. And I think my exit strategy right now, what I'm really working on is those consulting, speaking, and teaching things where I can do what my passion is and pick and choose it. Because when I retire from here, I'll have a pension. So I'll still have an income. I'll just need something to stay busy and something that satisfies my heart while I'm staying busy.
Right.
And then, I think that's going to be it, is the speaking and the consulting and that stuff.
They say you never really retire anyways. And like you said, after the average lifespan after retirement is 5 years for your profession. So keep working, brother.
My wife hates that statistic, man.
I bet.
And we're starting to beat that statistic because we're living better too. But it scares you to retire because you don't want to die.
If I could be so bold, I just want to, I'll edit this so there's not such a long pause. I'm trying to think of the right words to say this. Any women that are spouses to people in law enforcement, it's difficult. I can only imagine, but at the same time, I have a pretty good idea. And I've had some friends that are, in law enforcement and also have had those issues. It is a strong woman or a strong partner to be by someone's side. And it's a testament to your wife for 30 years or 29 years, I believe is what you said. So any other ladies out there listening, keep the faith.
For those ladies listening, there are, just like there's more resources for cops, there's more resources for spouses now too. And I guess not for ladies, for any spouse. So there's resources out there to help you deal with this, because you have to navigate waters that you're not used to, and you get sucked into our profession just by being married to us, which really isn't fair, but it is what it is. And I can tell you that the times that I was my best is when my wife was her best. And because that solid foundation at home just makes your job that much easier. And so definitely, if you're a spouse, hang in there. If you're having trouble, there's plenty of other, just get on social media, look for those spouses groups. There's spouses groups all over the place. And I love it. I love that wives are getting together and talking, because we close them out a lot of times to try and protect them. And then it ends up that you're actually not protecting them. You're damaging everything. And so it's great when the spouses get together and they figure out, oh, okay, this is why he acts this way, or this is why he won't talk to me at this time, that kind of stuff.
Matthew, I got your links for the books. I'll add those to the description. Anything else that I can promote for you, sir?
Oh man, just getting the book out there would be great, because I love when people give me feedback. Because I think as now an author, which is a weird title to have, but as an author, I love when people tell me that dude, I loved your book and I couldn't put it down, because I think that makes me feel like I did my job writing the book. And I love hearing people's story, because there's people that have reached out and said, man, your story sounds a lot like mine. And it's just cool when you get to interact with people, and that's the catalyst for it.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you're teaching and that you're sharing those experiences and what you've learned. I often talk about life as being, there's tools that you pick up, the foundational pillars, and then all the stuff that you learn after that, but it adds to that metaphorical toolbox. And what you've learned, there is no blueprint, there is no guide, and it's so invaluable. So I think it's great that you've turned into, or at least looking at teaching and training. I think that's a wonderful thing that you'd be doing, and really.
I think from my perspective, what happens a lot of times in our career too, with guys with my tenure on and experience and stuff, is we undervalue that, and you undervalue yourself, and you're always in your own head, right? I'm not good enough. Who am I to tell this person how to live, or whatever?
We're always our worst enemies.
Yeah, exactly.
Or imposter syndrome, I feel like it's so real.
Yeah, it is. And for me, that's been one of the biggest struggles, is overcoming my own self-doubt. Like with the book itself, overcoming the doubt that I could write a book and getting that done. And now moving forward, understanding that and this does it, you talk to different people and they're like, man, what you've done or been through or whatever. And you think, yeah, I guess I have done a lot, been through a lot. And so I have a lot to share. And that's one of the things I say when I teach classes to cops, is I'm not the expert of everything, but I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. And so I just try and pass on that knowledge.
Yeah, it's all about those nuggets. You shake the tree and something usually falls out.
That's it.
Sir, I appreciate the time that you took today. Thank you for everything that you do. Thank your wife. Thank your coworkers. I think it's amazing, especially with your line of work. It's obviously one of the most dangerous professions, period. But it's also in our communities fighting for what we love and believe in. And again, I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and God bless.
Likewise. You have a great day.
You too.
All right, bye now.
This has been Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with BeauTiffany.podbean.com, and follow Beau on social media by searching Digital Voices with Beau Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, Grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.